So the title of the presentation is Questions of Authority, the Three Hierarchies and Resistance to Tyranny. And the refrain, so to speak, that I'll be speaking and I hope you'll be hearing again and again and again is consider your station. Because if we are going to be Lutherans and biblical in resisting tyrannical authority, regardless of its source, we actually have to do it, well, biblically and as Lutherans. And that means we have to pay attention to the three hierarchies or the three estates. But let's start with the problem. The problem is totalitarianism. Almost 80 years ago, Emil Brunner wrote, "We are called, and who else is called if not Christians, to raise our protest against any form of state absolutism and omnipotence. Times have changed since the Reformation. At that time, the great need was to release the state from bondage to the church. Today, the need is to deliver life from suppression by the state." I think his choice of words there is very apt, for he doesn't just flip that equation. It's not just delivering the church from the bondage of the state, but rather life. Because the modern totalitarian state seeks to subsume everything under its authority, not just the church, but all life, period. But let's drill down a little bit more particular. Totalitarianism in America. Well, of course, Brunner's warning about absolutism and totalitarianism was not original in 1945, nor is it a novel or shocking sentiment today. Sam Francis aptly described the American slide into a particular type of totalitarianism back in 1997. The alteration of the Constitution from a document ruling a decentralized republic of self-governing citizens into one authorizing the construction of a centralized bureaucratic leviathan is an integral part of what James Burnham called the managerial revolution. The historical process by which law is replaced by administrative decree. Remind you of anything of late? Federalism is replaced by executive autocracy, and a limited government replaced by an unlimited state. So let's get to Rona, and let's get to a meme. Have you seen this meme? Wanting your life to be like an 80s movie, and then you forgot to specify which one. Not The Breakfast Club, but rather Red October. Now, I know many people were concerned from the very beginning in what I'm going to call Ronatide, the season of the coronavirus. I know a lot of people were concerned from the beginning, but think about how we were lulled into a sense of it's not going to be that bad. 2 weeks to slow the spread. Take 2 weeks off and watch Netflix. Well, it didn't turn out that way. In preparation for this presentation, I was going back and looking for some memes and some images. This certainly isn't a meme, but I remember back in 2020 seeing this online, and it was like being punched by, somebody in the gut. You remember how many children didn't get to see any friends, didn't get to go to school or get to play even outside with their neighbors. And so these two girls in masks, and the flip side is that they should be full of life and color, hugging and playing and acting like normal human beings. I think it's a good way to summarize what Ronatide was all about. You remember that season. Government officials made decrees as if they had unlimited authority. Many churches were closed for months, some even years. Family life totally upended. Countless elderly suffered and died alone. Countless jobs and businesses destroyed. Countless people pressured or coerced into taking experimental mRNA treatments, and the normalization of dehumanizing measures such as masks and enforced isolation has left scars we can hardly even begin to calculate. Like I said, I went back to try and find this image, and it was like being punched in the gut again. We humans are incredibly adaptable, and I think that if we don't actually purposefully and consciously remember what was done, then what do? We kind of move on. We cope. We get used to it. The memory fades, and we shouldn't. We shouldn't let that happen. We should keep it clear in our minds. And also, you remember not just Ronatide, but the responses. Generally speaking, the responses, especially from the American churches, were flat footed or, frankly, non existent. And Romans 13 was invoked as if it were an incantation designed to lull us into blissful inaction. So here's another, I would say, sad image. This man, locked up in isolation inside a nursing home, was not dying, but his granddaughter had just gotten engaged, wanted to talk to him, show him the ring. And this is as close as she was allowed to get. NGMI. Anybody know what that means? Not going to make it. Not going to make it. And that's what I have to say to you, which I don't think this crowd believes. But if you believe Romans 13 requires you to obey a ruler who forbids you to see your grandparents as he's dying, then you are not going to make it. I'm not going to try and argue against absurd angles and positions. I, of course, believe in the Bible. I believe what Romans 13 says. But I don't want to spend the next day and a half trying to parse out an argument that's totally detailed as if that position is serious. It's not a serious position. Everyone is going to draw a line. Even the folks that say Acts 5 just means you have to confess your faith. You won't stop preaching the gospel. That too is a line. That too is acknowledging an exception against and over and above the general rule of Romans 13. But again, that's why I want to pick this other very clear example. If you believe that the civil government actually can forbid you from seeing a dying grandparent or parent or aunt and uncle, that they must die alone in isolation without the company of their family, and that you think that that's what God would have you do, you aren't going to make it. That's just the plain truth. There's a word that I know some of you, who knows what anarcho-tyranny means? I see a couple hands, a couple nods. It's a wonderful, wonderful word. It's a word that I think really helps us be able to diagnose problems in the modern totalitarian state. So anarcho-tyranny, in terms of Ronatide, was lockdowns for the healthy, but protests for the aggrieved, those are just fine. Arrests for those walking on the beach during lockdowns. Remember the policemen on horses chasing down people walking on the beach? The safest place possible, out in fresh air, getting vitamin D from the sun. Those people got thrown into the back of cars, police cars. But amnesty for rioters. Masks and social distancing for toddlers, which makes no sense, because if anyone is not going to benefit by it, it's going to be them. But parties for the rich and powerful. Anarcho-tyranny is in some ways worse than an invasion in a Red Dawn style situation. Not that we don't already have an invasion going on anyway. But as Sam Francis wrote, what we have in this country today then is both anarchy, the failure of the state to enforce the laws, and at the same time tyranny, the enforcement of laws by the state for oppressive purposes. The criminalization of the law-abiding and innocent through exorbitant taxation, bureaucratic regulation, the invasion of privacy, and the engineering of social institutions, such as the family and local schools. The imposition of thought control through sensitivity training and multiculturalist curricula, hate crime laws, gun control laws that punish or disarm otherwise law-abiding citizens, but have no impact on violent criminals who get guns illegally, and a vast labyrinth of other measures. In a word, anarcho-tyranny. Sam Francis is long dead. He didn't write this after Ronatide, but about 2 decades before, well, I guess 15 years beforehand. So speaking of tests, let's look at the Ronatide response. However, one brief note. I don't want to litigate how people passed or failed the test. I'm not here to litigate the responses by you or each and every pastor individually. Many should, and I know many people have repented of their weaknesses and sin. But I really think that we, over the next day and a half, really need to plan for the future. Because you prepare for tests. I want to prepare for the future. Because Rona is still with us and insanely still hangs on in some places. You still see people driving around with masks on in their car. So it's not totally gone. But more importantly, it's going to keep coming back in different incarnations. The modern totalitarian state is always grasping for more power. And so these struggles are not over. So, Ronatide response, the future. How shall we as the church learn from our failures? What's the proper scriptural antidote to the compliant lethargy that ran rampant during Ronatide? And how shall we ensure that we will not so easily surrender to tyranny in the future? I keep on saying we as in general. The American church has failed by and large. Again, I'm not trying to drill down to you or other folks' particular response. So let's do two things. Number one, let's do a post-mortem on Ronatide. Why, and looking at particular trends and attitudes, why we as a society and church fell for Ronatide propaganda. And then secondly, we need to go back to God's word and specifically look at the three estates, how our forefathers looked at this during the Reformation, how they changed and developed and grew in their views more clear and deeper. And then also, scattered throughout, we're going to be looking at different biblical accounts. Okay, so societal trends. One trend that has been going on, again, much longer than Ronatide. All of these trends, I'm not saying happened during Ronatide, but rather they were already in place, and that's why the propaganda worked so easily and so effectively. And that, number one, is the idolatry of safety. You've heard it before. If it, whatever it is, whatever measure, if it saves just one life, it's worth it. That was said long before anyone heard of COVID-19. Think about where we probably fell off as a culture, off of this bike, so to speak. Well, it was with bike helmets. I think we lost the battle for any sane response to Rona way back when, back in the 90s, when we allowed, nervous Nellies to insist that all children have to wear bike helmets. That's crazy. It's insane. And yet we rolled right over. Think about seatbelt laws. I mean, seatbelts obviously help you out in most situations, but to criminalize not wearing a seatbelt? The idolatry of safety was firmly in place long before COVID-19 showed up. Or how about this other thing? Safety is our highest priority. Who's heard that when you gather for a sports team, like for a baseball team? Anybody hear this before? Safety is our highest priority. I remember hearing this even back when I was a kid and thinking, well, that's not true. Because if it was, we wouldn't actually play the baseball game, would we now? I mean, it's just on its face, not accurate, There's lots of things that we do. Safety is our highest priority. Yeah, I mean, I've never bungee jumped. Anybody bungee jumped before? I bet they say that too at the very beginning. Safety is our highest priority. I don't think if you're running a bungee cord jumping business that's really your highest priority. What's the highest priority? Let's have some fun. Let's have a thrill. But it is inherently taking a risk. If safety was our very highest priority, we wouldn't even leave our houses because a meteor might come down and smack us on the head. So safety is not always the highest priority, and also it's not always worth it to take measures that would save just one life. These are childish, they're simplistic, and they're very idealistic positions and myths that we should not just say, yeah, but you got to understand some. No, blow them up. That's what we got to do because they are not true. And they're in service to an idol. Safety is not always the highest priority. It is not to be our God above other things. Because fundamentally, of course, this is a religious struggle. And the idolatry of safety is definitely a competitor. Now, in terms of the idolatry of safety, I want to go into three trends, broader trends in society. First of all, the feminization of society. I think that this is pretty commonly accepted. I'm not going to try and do a big historical thing to prove this. But I want to state it very starkly. Without the 19th Amendment, Rona wouldn't have happened, plain and simple. I think that's undeniable. Why? Well, because totalitarianism is particularly a feminine mistake. Now, don't get me wrong, men have their own tendencies that are very bad. Usually, though, it's different than feminine mistakes. So if a woman by nature is going to tend towards, some women anyway, nagging. Anyone know a naggy woman? Yeah. I'm a little concerned. Oh, well, I guess we're calling out people today. Yeah. Those are my children. um, if a feminine, I always talk to couples when they come in for premarital or pre-engagement counseling that a particular tendency and fault that a woman is more apt to fall into is nagging. And men tend to fall into a different mistake or tendency, and that is laziness. I mean, okay, now the ladies in the room can say, yep. Anybody know a lazy guy? Yeah, every woman raises 3 hands. Okay. But again, those different tendencies are built into our nature because of who God made us, and of course the fall into sin. But I believe that it is fair to say totalitarianism, micromanaging, becoming a scold, that is typically a more feminine tendency or air. Think about it with mothers. Good many times equals what? Safe. And that actually makes sense inside the home, right? Because what do you have? You have a helpless infant that can't feed itself, that will put stupid things into its mouth, and will die. So the conflation of good and safety is actually very easy for women, particularly, to fall into. Of course, I'm generalizing. This is different for men. Men usually are very conscious of wanting to allow other guys to what? Have their space, right? A woman feels the need typically to find out if someone is okay or if something is wrong. But a man will do what? Well, if he needs help, what will he do? He'll ask. Yeah. I don't, I mean, many times I'm sure your wife or your mother or another woman in your life, speaking to the men particularly, will say, hey, how is so and so doing? I'm concerned. And of course, this is why God made male and female, for us to balance each other out, to work together as a team. But at the same time, how many times do you say, hey, if he needs help, he'll ask me? Men are going to err more on the side of not bothering people, not micromanaging, and women tend to err on the other side. And so I think the feminization of society definitely set us up to lift up safety as an idol. Okay, here's another aspect under the idolatry of safety. So we talked about male and female. Let's also talk about age. Gerontocracy is the rule of the elderly. That's what it literally means. And so I'll say another very stark statement. Without birth control and pensions, Rona wouldn't have happened, period. That's pointing out to the fact that because of the rise of modern hormonal birth control in particular, now we have a huge what? Age imbalance. Our, what are those called? You know how it's, yeah, the age pyramid is not a pyramid, right? It's an inverted pyramid, or at least it goes down like this. And so right now, in modern America and the modern West in general, the countries that obviously wield the vast majority of power across the globe, who has disproportionate power and authority as compared to any other time in history? The elderly. This is just a fact. And of course, again, the elderly, much like women, naturally are more concerned with safety. Why? Because if you compare a 25-year-old or even a 45-year-old, as compared to an 85-year-old, you're more frail. What's that?
That's why you don't play softball.
That's why you don't play softball. Well, okay. But what's that?
You got a guy going to the hospital this year.
Yeah. He's stronger for it now, right? But I think we all understand the point, right? The older you get, the more concerned and the more value you place on safety. So if you have a society that's dominated disproportionately as compared to the past by the elderly, then safety is going to become a higher and higher priority. Or to put it in the opposite way, the older you get, the more risk averse you become. That is, again, generally true. I'm sure you saw 90-year-olds jumping off of the bridge to do the bungee cord jumping, right? Nah, not so many, right? I'm sure that there's one or two anecdotal counterexamples, but that's not the point. And we saw this, again, not with every single person who is older. So again, I'm generalizing, but think about it. What was the balancing act, or rather, the imbalancing act? Normalcy for younger generations on one side and the economic future of nations versus safety for the elderly. I don't think it would have been possible for the government to do what they did if we lived in a time where the population pyramid was more natural. Also, especially with the experimental vaccines, possibly poisoning those at the beginning of their life to possibly extend slightly the life of those at the end of their life, generational sacrifice. I remember having many parishioners come up to me and say, hey, well, we need to be concerned about the safety of those who are very adversely affected, who actually have the risk of passing away, which, of course, was only the very, very old in any meaningful numbers. And they said, shouldn't we be concerned about the elderly? And I said, yes, of course we should. But does that mean that the measure that we should take should jeopardize the future of people at the beginning of their lives? I remember hearing as a child, and all throughout my life, I'm sure you've heard it too, is that what? The older generations sacrificed for who? For the younger generations. Now, of course, it's not just a one-way street. The young are, under the fourth commandment, to what? Care for elderly parents, grandparents, and whatnot. Jesus makes a special point to speak of this. Yet at the same time, especially with the quote-unquote vaccines, there really was a strange upside-down reversal of sorts of who should sacrifice for who. It wasn't just a reversal, but it was incredibly lopsided. And again, I think that gerontocracy really fits in with this idolatry of safety. Have you heard this term laptop class? Anybody? Okay, a few people. It's kind of new to me as well. But the laptop class is folks that can do almost all of their job from a computer. And we saw this come out in Ronatide, where you had a big division because those who could, work from home, work remotely was the term, versus everybody else. And so again, I'll say something just kind of very starkly. Without deindustrialization, Rona wouldn't have happened, period. Because you would have had an overwhelming percentage of workers that said, no, I have to eat, I have to put food on the table, and to eat and to put food on the table means I have to go to a physical place and work. Maybe not manual labor necessarily, but I have to go to an actual place and work. And so I think this is a part or an aspect of what has been rising in America, that widespread despisement of blue-collar workers or the working class. And this despisement really came out in a particularly nasty way during Ronatide from many of those who could work remotely and didn't have to risk getting their hands dirty in terms of the Rona. The laptop class could sit at home and still collect a paycheck, right? This is very similar to the elderly. The pressure wasn't on because of pensions, because of Social Security. And so you had a very strange situation, unlike any time in the past, where lots of people could work without ever leaving their homes and having to be socially interacting. And so it made it a lot easier for the government to forbid those things. So the next societal trend that I want to talk about is the cult of experts. So again, this was in place long before Rona. So we're all familiar, and this is not just in society, but it's in the church as well, the atomization and compartmentalization of knowledge. And this wonderful word, if you don't know it, it's great to know, credentialism. Here's one definition: excessive reliance on credentials, especially academic degrees, in determining hiring or promotion policies. Bob Pritchett says credentialism is a luxury of a rich society where status, appearances, and politics can be esteemed over competence. How many times were we told just to trust the experts versus what works? Who are you going to trust more? A theoretical physicist when it comes to building a bridge, or an engineer? I mean, I know who I'm going to trust because they actually get the bridge built. It's not just theoretical. John W. Gardner wrote, "The society which scorns excellence in plumbing as a humble activity and tolerates shoddiness in philosophy because it is an exalted activity will have neither good plumbing nor good philosophy. Neither its pipes nor its theories will hold water." And so credentialism and an over-reliance, I'm not saying that degrees mean nothing. I'm not saying that the experts have nothing to offer. You know, I don't think we should go to an extreme despisement of elite training. But at the same time, there is an over-reliance. The last societal trend that I want to talk about is the ministry of lies. And I did cast these in religious language, you know, the cult of experts, the ministry of lies, the idolatry of safety, because the totalitarian state is indeed a deification of the state, and it's a religious threat. So we all know in the modern world, propaganda is incredibly important and effective, and we do live in what's been termed an informational society with incredible access to lots of information, maybe not true all the time, but incredible amounts. Mass media has been around for a few generations, but what has particularly, I would say, helped spread the fear-mongering and the mistakes during Ronatide was, of course, social media. This is not news to you. I'd also point out that we have an incredibly conformist population, which also dovetails with the feminization of society. George Orwell pointed this out in 1984, which was not written. When was it written? It wasn't written in 1980. Was it 48? Okay, thank you. So don't be confused about that. That's just the name of the title. He writes, "It was always the women, and above the young ones, who were the most bigoted adherents of the party, the swallowers of slogans, the amateur spies and nosers out of unorthodoxy," which describes every single blue-haired scold on the internet. I mean, he hit it perfectly. I would amend one thing, though. He says it was always the women and above all the young ones. However, I think to drill down more, typically unmarried women. Because again, these are big generalizations. I'm sure you could come up with anecdotes that would point to the other side. But generally speaking, unmarried women will see the state or the government basically like a husband, there to what? Protect and provide. And so when you have a modern society such as ours, where many unmarried women marry the state, so to speak, society suffers, as one blogger once put it. Okay, let me pause again if there's any questions or comments before we get to the synod. Yeah.
Yeah, it occurred to me that as a couple of things that this you already touched on, but I think the Ronatide also wouldn't have happened simply without the internet. Because that helps the atomization thing and the working from home, and also the
pressuring conformist people. Yeah.
Social media, all that. We think of the internet as such a great thing, and it helps us. It's helping you right now. You know, it's sort of, how can you argue against that? But gee whiz, we're stuck.
This is not the internet. This is.
Well,
I know. I'm just kidding.
Close.
I know. I'm giving you a hard time. Right here. The mic's coming for you.
So you mentioned something about experts, right? And I don't know that it's necessarily right. I mean, you even said experts, degrees aren't bad, but when education changed and the goal of education, I mean, you don't sit in a college classroom today learning from a teacher who is an expert.
Yeah.
You're there to, be indoctrinated or this or that. So when you hear trust the experts, well, what they're not truly.
Yeah. And are they competent, right? Where have they proven themselves?
I even had a doctor, you talking about Dr. Fauci and everything. I even had a doctor tell me, well, you look great, but your numbers are wrong, so you need to take this.
Yeah.
Like, well, there's nothing wrong with me. I feel great and all of this. Like, well, I guess I should go by what I see and not what the paper's telling me.
And that's where the internet plays in with that, where instead of trusting your five senses of what you actually literally see, it's conform to the mob saying X, Y, or Z. I mean,
It's your lying eye.
exactly, right. And like what you said, people saying, trust Dr. Fauci, trust these experts that are saying that COVID-19 was the bubonic plague. I mean, let's remember, these were also, generally speaking, the experts that gave us the food pyramid. I mean, I mean, that's ridiculous. So yeah, absolutely.
And there's always a grain of truth in it, which is what it lives by.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's not, I mean, the half lie is always more dangerous than the straight up absurdity. Yeah.
So I'd like you to comment on, so when I was growing up, the news happened at 5 o'clock and at 10 o'clock. And now it's 24/7 all the time. So is there something within humanity that desires something like that needs to be approached and preached to versus kind of a top down, we're going to give you all this information? It seems like they wouldn't do that if there weren't a market for it. Does that make sense?
Well, sure. I mean, all of us want to be told what is the truth. I mean, it's a good thing for us to understand that in and of ourselves, we don't know everything, right? So it's by nature and by design that God wants us to be preached to rephrase what you're saying. So I don't think that desire is wrong, but of course, it all depends on whose preaching are you listening to. But I do think that one of the points that you said is very important as well. I kind of glossed over a lot of the propaganda stuff, but I mean, propaganda is most effective when it is what? It's saturation. So the amount is a quality. I mean, quantity is a quality all of itself. And that's important because many people think, well, these lies are so obvious, and so it doesn't matter how many times they're told, people will be able to resist it. No, I mean, you say things a couple times and people just kind of default click in. I mean, you have to keep up a serious, renewed resistance to not fall into what's easiest, which is to go with the flow, right? I saw another, yes.
Concerning gerontocracy, I'm used to telling women to stay in their place. Okay? But no, that's a joke. So, but concerning the elderly and respecting your elders, it's a little more difficult for me to say, no, you don't have the right to tell me to take a vaccine or to play the mask game. So what is a proper, respectful way to respond to your elders when they want to push these limits on you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think just to summarize or restate it, the question is he's used to saying, a woman should stay in her sphere and her place, but with the elderly, who we should honor and respect. I mean, we should honor and respect women, but that's a different matter than the elderly, who God has put above the younger generations. So it's a different vector, so to speak. How do we go about that in a respectful way? Well, I mean, I can't remember the citation. Is it Paul or Peter who says that when you correct an older man, that you do it with gentleness and respect? Somebody help me with the quote. What's that? As you would a father, exactly. So I think the way that you do it is going to look differently. And when, let's flip the script. When a wife wants something from her husband, as I try to tell folks who are about to get married, again, the tendency is to what? For a woman to think short term and nag to get what she wants, right? But long term, it's better if she appeals to him, right? When you are requesting something from a superior, you should appeal. Why? Because you're pricking their sense of duty and the obligations that they have given by God to you. And so I guess I would say I kind of already touched on this, but I'll highlight it when I said, I didn't put it in the right context, but when elderly folks at my congregation said, so how do I balance this out? Frankly, the elderly folks at my congregation were really good, I would say by and large, about, hey, we've got to have balance here. But they wanted help thinking this through from their pastor. And I said, well, Let's go back to that old aphorism. Who sacrifices for who, right? Because you are pricking their sense of duty, right? Yes, a total blunt, let's just look at the facts. These people are going to die in what, 5 to 10 years, versus these people who have 70 to 80 years left on their life. I mean, that's a really kind of punch in the face. But that's why I think approaching someone like a father is wonderful, where you appeal to him. You say, is it not true, father? Or, patriarch or matriarch, is it not true that we should see ourselves, the older generations, as being willing to sacrifice and lay down our lives, and not the other way around? That's what I would say. The exact wording, I don't know, but if you're thinking appealing, like not it's appealing, but you appeal to the person, that's the way to do it. Yeah.
Well, and I wonder with the like the nursing home situations, if it wasn't a lot more the power of the propaganda that you mentioned than the tendencies of the elderly. Like I don't think probably that the nursing homes were filled with people who were calling for, we need to close down, we need to not let our family visit us, right?
Yeah.
They came to believe that over time, but that wasn't their natural inclination to be cut off from society, right?
No, and I guess I would make a distinction, because you're absolutely correct, where the very elderly or infirm, they inhabit a position similar to a child. That's no disrespect, but the old saying, once a man, twice a child, right? Certainly the people in the nursing homes, by and large, they knew it was worth it. They knew it was worth it. I guess what I'm saying is that there were large swaths of the American public who were on the older end of the spectrum, but not locked away in a nursing home, that were willing to sacrifice the future of young people or the future economy or whatnot. So yeah, thank you for bringing out that clarification.
Maybe you're going to touch on this later, but being in Illinois, the phrase "we're just following the science" has become ingrained in my brain. So the idea of science as observation, rather than these kind of, these scientific mandates from on high,
Yeah.
that seems to be playing a pretty big part in this too. That, historically, traditionally, science has been observational. You observe things and then you make conclusions. But now it's basically flipped, seems like it's flipped on its head, and almost entirely.
Well, at least when the alleged science coheres with the ruling totalitarians, right? Yeah, it's very convenient. But no, Greavy, you're anticipating where I'm going, so I'm just going to let your comment stand, and we will get to that in a little bit. Let's look at the synod weaknesses, and I think that everything that I just talked about in terms of the society could also be applied to our synod. That's kind of natural, because the Missouri Synod is in America. It's made up of Americans. And so what infects the society is going to infect the population of the society, including Christians, to a lesser or greater extent. So think about what we talked about in terms of propaganda. I mean, we were all subjected as the church to the same propaganda, and I think we have the same susceptibility to it. If you think about the idolatry of safety, I mean, the Missouri Synod is certainly more feminized now than in the days of Walther and Pieper. I don't think that's seriously questioned. In terms of age, our population, even more so than America, skews older. And then, what was the last one? What's that? No, the laptop class and expertise and credentialism. I think those in the synod kind of are interwoven, because think about the leadership, the quote unquote experts in the church, by and large, are who? Well, the professionals, right? The pastors, and then the synodical administration and bureaucracy, going from circuit, district, all the way up to synod. And so pastors, in a certain way, are neither fish nor fowl. And when I say pastors, I mean the ones in the parish pastors, right? So parish pastors aren't obviously working class in the sense of they are fixing cars or they're doing things with their hands. I don't think it would be fair to call us blue collar. And yet at the same time, unlike remote workers, we have to what? Go see people, right? And where the rubber really hits the road, if that's an okay way to put it, when we speak about the sacrament, a lot of Reformed churches could what? Well, you can hear preaching through the interwebs. We can do online Zoom Bible studies. But for Lutherans, every single week, when you did the Pax Domini and you held up the true body and blood of the Lord, that was an act of not just religious defiance against the sacrifice of the Mass or the rejection of the sacrament by the Reformed, but it was a political defiance against those who said, you may not do this. You may not pour out Christ's lifeblood for your people. And so parish pastors are definitely kind of straddling, kind of the white collar world and the blue collar world. But as you go up the hierarchy, it quickly becomes a lot less having a need to meet in person. You can do a lot of meetings through Zoom. And the Council of Presidents did that, right? They don't have to actually see each other under these unusual circumstances. So again, I think that a lot of our leadership falls into the laptop class, which again is going to create a tendency to not see the immediate need for people to gather and receive the Lord's Supper. I mean, again, I don't want to speak ill or unfairly of our leaders. I know that they knew those things intellectually, but there's a difference between the person who is an architect who says, this is how we're going to draw up and build this building, versus the guy who's actually pounding the nails and screwing the drywall up. You know what I mean? And so parish pastors were much closer to that, and by nature, by circumstance, are going to be more sensitive to that, versus the leadership, which is more removed. So I think that really plays a role in all of this. Also, I think that another thing that was already true in the synod, the Missouri Synod, not just the churches of America, was that we've outsourced a lot of the church's duties. And we've relied on experts. That's getting back to the expert thing. Now, I don't want to go through a million examples. I'll just bring up one. How many times have you heard about a pastor saying, someone came to me with a problem and I met with them a couple times, but because I couldn't fix it, or it didn't seem like we were going anywhere, what does he do? He shuttles them off to who? A counselor, a psychobabbler, right? A psychologist, a psychiatrist, and outsources that work. How many times have you heard pastors say, well, I'm just a minister of the gospel. That's all I've got to give is the forgiveness of sins. Now, obviously, the forgiveness of sins is the chief matter, but we don't have wisdom from the scriptures? Who's going to be the doctor of souls? I mean, psychologists are named that way because they think they can actually be doctors of souls. I've got no problem with real science that's backed up with real data, real observation, real testable results. But we've been outsourcing a lot of stuff, especially to psychology, for, I would say, a few decades now. I think that again, made us open to outsourcing our ideas about what to do. Let's just trust this expert. Shuttle somebody off. That's too much of a problem. Also, and this is undeniable, atrophied muscles. If you don't lift, what's going to happen to your muscles? They're going to atrophy. That's just the way it is. And we, as a synod, do have atrophied muscles, and some of it's not, quote unquote, our fault. It's just the way it is. We haven't experienced religious persecution to a really big extent for generations. So yeah, there was the anti-German wave during World War I. But I mean, who is alive anymore for that? We're several generations away from real persecution from the state. We'll probably get there quick enough, though. So I think that one word that describes the big weakness of the synod, I've already talked about how there is the mantra of Romans 13, obey, obey, just don't think, just obey. But also unprepared, lacking leadership. Sometimes it was very frustrating to me, and I've heard this from countless pastors, we were looking to the synod or to those who've been set aside to help guide and shape the broader church, that it wasn't, I mean, no one expected advice super particular. This is what you need to do at St. John's here in Mattoon. Exactly all of these beats and all of these points. But not even a framework. Just obey. Obey. Again, this is a generalization. Certain districts and officials did better than others. But again, I'm not here to litigate that. So I think there's a huge lack of leadership and just a lack of communication and what to do, even how to think about what to do. And then also a lacking a sensitivity to particularity. You know, we do live in an ideological age where here's these truths and we're going to just mindlessly apply them. I mean, that's kind of the attitude of the absolutist Romans 13 crowd. Obey. Yeah, but who's the one giving the order? What are the circumstances? In what manner? How long has this been going on? Doesn't matter. Obey. Really? The particularity does not matter? It doesn't matter the circumstances? That's very strange. And so I think that we need to recover that. And then last but not least, we were lacking a framework on how to even think about it. You can't come up with answers until what? You actually have a framework of how to diagnose the problem and move towards solutions. So speaking of mindset, a mindset that I hope that you will have to a greater extent after this presentation, moving forward. If I can accomplish one thing over the next few presentations, I hope that I can move some of the mental furniture in your mind. And on those same three things, that you have a deeper understanding of leadership, greater sensitivity to particularity, equity. I don't mean equity how the modern left talks about it, but equity taking true principles and applying it to a particular situation, and also the proper framework on how to go after these things. So let's use an example for the nerds in the audience. Anybody know Star Trek: The Next Generation? Yeah, okay. Now I know who to avoid later. No, I'm joking. I grew up watching it myself. You can blame my parents. But experts in leadership. So I think Star Trek is not a good show because it's leftist. It really is. That's another discussion for another time. But I will tell you what, both the original series and The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, which that was the last one that I watched, they were the show all throughout those many seasons and many episodes was incredibly sensitive to issues of command. And it's very commendable, actually. I'll just use The Next Generation as an example. So if you're not familiar with the show, which maybe some of you aren't, the balding gentleman is Jean-Luc Picard, who's the captain, right? And he's the consummate, calm, deliberative captain who wants to hear from all of the experts. And honestly, he does a great job of it. So oftentimes there would be a situation, I don't mean like a situation where you need a snap decision, but a situation where you have time to sit back and reflect. And they'd go to this room. I don't remember what the room is. If you know, I don't want to know. But they go to this room and they consult, and he consults with the experts, the best on the ship. So going from right to left, you've got this alien Klingon who's from a warrior race. And so his advice in every situation is what? Fight. Blow him up, right? There's a problem, blow him up. Kind of like if you're a hammer, every problem is a nail. But isn't that true for experts? That's how experts think too. A medical professional, they are going to naturally, by nature, and in many ways that's good, they're going to be hyper-focused on what? Yeah, saving lives, making people healthier, that this is what we need to prioritize. But this is also the point of what I'm bringing up. Experts are distinct from, even though they relate to, leaders, commanders, those who are in control and have authority. Experts give lots of valuable facts and insights, but they do not command, and that's a good thing. You don't want the experts in charge. And I don't just say that because I think the experts were wrong, But you never want that. That's not the normal state of affairs. Leaders are precisely set apart to weigh out the facts, the possible scenarios or future possibilities, and duties that lead to what? Commands, orders. So a typical situation in the next generation would be Jean-Luc Picard saying, well, there's this problem, blah, blah, blah. And Worf says, blow up the bad guys, right? And then you've got Dr. Crusher, who's saying, well, we've got to bend over backwards to make sure we save these lives, right? And then you've got Data coming up with some crazy, factoids and whatnot. And then you've got Geordi, the scientist, who says, well, there's this scientist from 50 years ago who developed this theory, and if that's true, and these 15 other things are true, then we'll save the day without harming a soul. Yeah, there's a lot of ifs in that plan, and maybes. And then finally, after all the experts speak, but not the counselor, you remember her? Counselor Troy? Yeah, Troy isn't even in this picture, which is great, because she's basically a space psychologist, which means she's useless. And has nothing to contribute of any value. So anyway, Picard will listen, right? And we should listen to those who have expertise. And he goes and he waits. And finally, he turns to the second in command, Riker. What do you think? Because that's his job, to give his recommendation to the captain. Because he's also not necessarily an expert, even though he has expertise in some things, but because he's part of command. Right? He's in charge. He's the vice president of the ship, so to speak. So Picard wants all the facts out on the table, and then he wants to listen to someone who is thinking the same way he is about how do we weigh all this stuff out? How do we consider all of the possibilities? What's our highest duty? Experts can be right about facts if they're actually observing and following the scientific method. But at the end of the day, it is leaders who apply those realities and they balance out duties to actually issue orders and lead people down a road. And so Picard will listen to Riker and then he'll make his decision. So that's what I wanted to get to, what you were talking about, Greavy, about experts and leadership. So particularity. Particularity, and we really have lost the art of casuistry by and large. I already talked about it's insane if you don't take particular circumstances into account. And that's what casuistry is, right? When you're talking casuistry, you are not typically talking about, well, is it right for someone to steal or to commit adultery or not? That's not the point. The point is how do we apply these truths to this particular hard, fuzzy, difficult situation? Well, this is very similar to a farmer needing to know his land. What kind of a fool would a farmer be if he said, I'm going to treat every single piece of my property exactly the same? It doesn't matter if the soil is the same. It doesn't matter if we get the same amount of runoff. It doesn't matter about what crops we're planting here or there. It doesn't matter. All that matters is crops need what? Water and sunlight, and so we're going to treat everything the same. No, you have to be sensitive to particularity, and we need to be sensitive to particularity as well.
Thank you for your point so far. I wonder, as far as the criticism or the proper support of Synod, if I'd like your response. Was it not heretical to sanction the closing or the suspension of public services because of the improper definitions of what a church is that our Synod lost sight of, and also the freedom of a Christian, so that we cannot speak of church without the incarnate gathering of saints? And I guess first your response to that we lost the definition of what church was, along with feminization and all the social trends that we bought into.
Yeah, so I honestly am going to say that only became clear as we got deeper into the situation. Because, again, I'll be honest, I don't think that there are zero circumstances where it would be right for us to actually obey the government and maybe not meet for a week. If you're in 1940, what, 4 or 5 Dresden, and the Allies are bombing the city to ashes, and the city government says, we're setting out a rule, no more than 25 people gather, right? Because if you do, you're going to be a target. And so suspend services for a week, please. Now, I think it would be better for an appeal and with overwhelmingly clear circumstances. Or if you're out west somewhere and the local government says, hey, it's Saturday night. Pastor, don't hold services. We have to evacuate. A wildfire is sweeping through. But again, and we'll get into this later, who has satisfied the burden of proof, you know? So I don't think it's absolutely true that the government can never, ever, ever tell us under very clear emergency circumstances. And that's why I guess for those pastors and congregations in states that said, hey, let's shut down for 2 weeks and then we'll go back to normal, they could say, you know what? 2 weeks isn't that huge of a deal. We don't know what's going on. So even there, I personally would have disagreed because the burden of proof is on them to prove the emergency because they're treading into our estate. However, where I think I would agree with you is when they allowed the government to interminably keep them shut and they just acquiesced. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
And I appreciate your point with the burden of proof, but in the case of uncertainty or unclarity, why then would the church acquiesce to the state when we know the proper definition of what a church is and how faith will be strengthened amidst all of the problems? And maybe that's for.
We're going to get more into this later. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was thinking about how you were talking about the farming out of, like, the pastors. He notices that some couple or some person might need psychological help and he farms it out to somebody else. I think there might be something else going on as well. And I think that ironically, it stems from a kind of laziness, which you mentioned as a male principle, because the pastor, I fear, doesn't quite know what he's supposed to be doing. So rather than farming out psychology, he will become something of a lay psychologist, which is even worse.
Yeah, because he doesn't trust in the necessity of the wisdom and the message he brings to the table.
Yeah, and the word.
Yeah.
Instead of that, because he doesn't really know it. So he thinks, well, I got to do how many times in my own history have I remembered, especially in older days, when pastors would say, well, it's time for me to do counseling. I'm available all afternoon for counseling. What's counseling? I mean, that's not in the history and the language of the church. That's psychological talk.
It is. I mean, if you want to say, I will give you pastoral counsel from the scriptures, maybe you could still save that word. But no, I agree. That's exactly what it is.
I appreciate your bit on leadership as well as on particularity, casuistry. Now, what happens when we don't actually agree on the overarching principles that are to be operating? So it seems like that was what was in play.
And that's what, I don't know your name again.
Marcus Manley.
Manley. I think that was Manley's point. Like, we got a principle wrong, and that's why we didn't do this right. And I think by and large, you're probably right. I just wanted to say that there might be some circumstances where we can't categorically deny it might be wise for us to shut down. Yeah, but yes. Yeah, if we don't have the principles right, then we're like ships passing in the night in terms of application. Absolutely. And that's a deeper problem, which I do agree with you guys on. Yeah.
You brought up laziness that men display really until, this is a result of the fall, right? Your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you, right? So we'll kind of sit back until all of a sudden our leadership is threatened, and then we reassert our position. But I'm wondering too how much this plays into the atrophy point and not undergoing persecution. I mean, we see this in in the scriptures very clearly that this is really a mark of the church to be
Yeah.
going through this persecution. But the church in America has really set herself up in every way to avoid it, to be married to society in such a way where, we won't talk about this sin or that sin, or we'll overly generalize it so nobody,
Feels
really will leave us alone,
Yeah.
right? So we can be comfortable. And I'm wondering how much of that played into this situation where our elders and even some of us younger guys just kind of decided to be like Hezekiah and say, the word that you've spoken is good. We'll let the next generation.
Yeah.
Right. But at what point do we say this isn't going away?
Yeah.
We have to deal with this. We have to stand up as the church and proclaim the truth for the sake of the next generation.
Absolutely. And this is the point about training and planning for the future that I was talking about. Because, think of like a fireman. He can, he can pass his fireman academy, right, and pass all the tests. And if he doesn't practice for 5 years and he never goes into any fires, he's not going to be all that good. This is why for certain what is it, ratings and things like that in the military, you have to keep up your hours, right? You got to put in your hours or else you lose qualifications. I'm using the wrong terminology, but you understand the point. And so it's not up to us of when persecution is going to come, right? It's not up to the fireman of, hey, there hasn't been a fire in a while. I wish something would burn down so I can get some practice in. But what can he do? He can train, right? Will he be as good as a guy who fights fires every other week for those same 5 years, even if he trains as hard as he can? No, because nothing supplants the real thing. But if you train, you are going to be a lot better. You're going to anticipate what's going to happen. And that's what was very disappointing, I think, in the response, not just in the Synod, but by Christian America, the churches of America, was that they weren't even trying to approach the problem. They hadn't thought this through. I mean, professionals are set aside to what? I mean, I don't like that word professional, but I'm using it to highlight the difference between people who just do it for fun, right? Professionals are paid to think through these possibilities. I mean, imagine if a police officer walked into a situation, it went horrible, and then he just said, well, I'd never thought about, a bad guy pulling a weapon. What do you mean? Well, we never thought the government would shut us down. That's your job, to think this through. That's why you're paid. So yeah, we got to get to training. That's the answer. We got to get those muscles working. We got to get to training. We got to think about it, and you can only do that if you have the right framework. And that's what we will be getting into after this huge quote later the next session. So I think that's probably a good point to wrap up.